I want to offer a very warm welcome to a first-time guest on the A Minute to Midnight show, Scott Chapman. We've not had you before, Scott, but I've heard a lot of good things and I've listened to a little bit of your stuff. Got a PDF of yours in front of me, and I think we're going to be in for a fascinating show. So, welcome.
Hey, Tony, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited about it too, because it's not a subject we've covered before. And the subject is the grand solar minimum. Now, I'm sure a lot of people don't even have a clue what that is. Some people will. Maybe you could start off by giving our listeners a bit of a background into who you are, what you do, and then what the GSM is.
Sure thing. So my name is Scott Chapman. I have the online pseudonym of Charles Scott. There's a reason why I have a pseudonym. I can explain it later. So I don't have a scientific background. I'm not a PhD. I'm just a fan of science. I actually have a military background. I graduated college in the year 2000, and then I enlisted in the Army. I spent 4 years with 2nd Range Battalion. From there, I moved into the executive protection, bodyguard work. From there, I felt the need to go back overseas. So I spent 6 years working as a high-threat security contractor for the U.S. government. I was hurt. Then I was unable to deploy in 2015. From there, I opened my own business. So it was during that time that I owned my own business where I had a tremendous amount of time to myself. My employees worked overnight. As a new business owner, I didn't hire any employees, so I was the employee and the owner. So I worked overnight, and I had an enormous amount of time to study anything I've ever wanted to study. And I used that time to study subjects like string theory and gravity, time dilation, ancient cataclysms, things that just really piqued my interest. Well, I came across a YouTube channel called Adapt 2030, and he was talking my language. He was talking about ancient cataclysms, but he was connecting solar activity to these events, and so now he was talking my language. So I started to just go down the rabbit hole. I started to try and learn as much as I could about this, because at that time these were just internet voices, not real people. So I made myself a subject matter expert in an attempt to try and debunk it, really. I wanted to poke holes in these stories. And what these people were talking about is something called a grand solar minimum. So I'm going to explain what that is in a minute. But the more I researched this, the more I studied it, the more I realized how complex the issue is, or how complex it is to even explain it to people. I listened to all the channels. I've not only their recent broadcasts, I listened to all their archive shows. I studied scientific papers from real PhDs, from real science, real scientists, and it's not just studying science, but you also have to look at history and understand where the sun connects into history. So there's so many different avenues of trying to understand this thing. I quickly realized that it's way more complex than just a 30-second elevator pitch or even a 5-minute conversation. It's a gigantic story. So over 3 years, I saved every chart, every graph, every link, every reference, everything that I thought was relevant to try and explain this to a beginner, someone who has no idea what the grand solar minimum is. So I had all these charts and graphs and PDFs saved on my computer, and I started to really just assemble them. And after looking at it for quite a while, I realized, it's just a puzzle, right? You just need to put the puzzle pieces in the right order. So one thing I always like to say is that the PDF that I created, it's a GSM beginner's guide. The PDF I created, it's not my work, right? All I did was put it in the right order. I like to say that I'm standing on the shoulders of geniuses, whereas it's their work, their research. But all of these scientists or all of these presenters or all of these experts are so compartmentalized that geologists aren't talking to plasma physicists. Solar physicists aren't talking to mathematicians, right? It's such a broad topic that it encompasses our entire species. So it's a gigantic story that for the first time, someone hasn't been able to put it together in the right order. And I offer it available for free on my website. It's supergsminfo.com. At one time, I had a $10 price tag on it. I didn't intend to, buy a second home by selling $10 presentations. I intended to make it more valuable to the person who bought it, because someone tends to cherish something that they pay for versus something they have for free. Right? If something is free, they deem it as not having value. As of June 1st, I received some confirmation about some certain events that I realized I needed to remove the paywall and make it available to anyone who wants it. So it's 100% free. It's you can download it on my website while you still can. It's a 75-page PowerPoint presentation that explains the grand solar minimum from start to finish. And in order to understand it, I have to teach some basic science as well as some recent scientific breakthroughs, and I have to connect known historical events to what the sun was doing.
So we have people talking about global warming, and we've got climate change, this huge climate change agenda, and none of those people are talking about the sun or natural things being the cause of climate havoc. They're all saying, we need to, stop our cars and and close factories down that use coal, and it's all carbon this, and we've got to charge people or whatever. And I think it's just a big scheme to get people into a new world order, basically. So the elephant in the room has got to be, the sun and things, and other natural factors are affecting this, rather than it's just man changing our climate. So they're not talking about this grand solar minimum, really. Why is that?
So why aren't they talking about the grand solar minimum? The sun has been active for about 40 years. The sun has been producing a lot of energy, a lot of heat. So politicians realize that people will pay anything to save the planet. They realize that if they ride the wave of an active sun, they can say that we're the cause of it, that the Earth was heating. Well, yes, it was heating. Well, it wasn't heating because of us. It was heating because the sun was more active. The sun was producing more energy. So yes, the planet has been heating. But as of 2014, we started a descent into a deep, long cycle called a grand solar minimum. Global warming has ended and global cooling has begun. So politicians realize that people will pay anything to, quote, save the planet. Right? Who's against the planet? Or who's against saving the planet? So one thing I like to point out is the term global warming was the catchphrase up until 2006. Well, what happened in 2006? Mr. John Casey, former NASA scientist, author of Dark Winter and Upheaval. Credentials, again, a mile long, real scientist. He held a press conference in 2006 to announce that global warming had ended. Global cooling had begun. Well, it was that same year that the narrative changed from global warming to, quote, climate change. Now, climate change is a fortune cookie. It can mean anything to anyone. If it's hot, it's climate change. If it's cold, it's climate change. If your dog barks, it's climate change. Everything is blamed on climate change. Well, it doesn't mean anything. It's just how you interpret it. So the real threat is climate change. However, it's not man-made climate change. It's the sun.
So we've been through these cycles before, and that's what the grand solar minimum is all about. So I guess this is where you got to begin and explain to people what it really is, so that they get a handle on why you're saying that we're heading into a period of global cooling, which to some people they'd be going, hang on a second, we've just seen record temperatures in some parts like Kuwait and parts of Europe, I think this week, are expecting their hottest weather, and yet other places like Colorado and the US have had dumps of snow unseasonably. And I'm sitting here in New Zealand with my fire going, and it's winter, of course, but it's so far been a fairly mild winter, really.
Right. So there's reasons why we're seeing extreme heat, and there's reasons why we're seeing extreme cold. There's very simple to explain reasons. So let me give you a brief overview of the grand solar minimum. So it all started with the discovery of sunspots. Sunspots were discovered simultaneously with the invention of the telescope, roughly 400 years ago. Okay? So it was the first step to understand the sun's magnetic fields, and that's what it's all about, is understanding how the sun's magnetic fields interact with each other and how they affect our planet. So sunspots, consider them as measuring sticks, right? Little dark spots on the sun that appear and disappear seemingly at random. So measuring sticks, well, what do they measure? They tell us what the sun's magnetic fields are doing, okay? Well, why is that important? It's important because sunspots first showed us that the sun has natural cycles. So what did these early scientists do? They simply counted the number of sunspots they saw and counted the number of sunspotless days. It's truly that simple. So they observed that every 11 years, we saw a maximum and a minimum. It's a wave. There's a minimum, a maximum, and a minimum, up and down, over 11 years. So that is the smallest of the solar cycles. It's called the Schwab cycle. So these smaller cycles, if you stand back far enough and see a larger sample, well, they're grouped together. They're grouped together, and they're either stronger or weaker than the group to the left or to the right. Collections of 11-year cycles that are stronger or weaker to the cycles to the left and right. So there's cycles within cycles within cycles. There's multiple cycles. Some of these cycles are called grand cycles, right? Grand solar minimum, grand solar maximum. There's also super grand cycles, super grand solar minimum. So how do these cycles affect you? So when the sun is active, right, we see more sunspots. It's hotter. It produces more heat. Sunspots don't control the sun's temperature. Rather, they're an indicator of what the sun's magnetic fields are doing. Well, when the sun is inactive, it's cooler. It produces fewer sunspots or no sunspots. So next, you have to connect known history. You have to look at known historical events and see what the sun was doing during that time. For example, there's a time between 1350 and 1800 known as the Little Ice Age. Well, what was the sun doing? Well, that was a grand cycle. That was a collection of 11-year cycles that were altogether collectively weaker than the grand cycle to the left and grand cycle to the right. You just need to take another step back and step back to see the cycles within cycles. So why is studying history important? Okay, well, humans thrive in the warmth. We don't do so good in the cold. We're a fragile species. We're extremely fragile. All right, we fall from a great distance, we die. We get too hot, we die. We get too cold, we die. We don't eat enough food, we die. We're extremely fragile. We are not masters of this universe. It's easy for us to forget that because we have the internet, cell phones, and we drive cars, but there's nothing more important than your ability to feed yourself 3 times a day. On a basic level, that's it. So what's so important about the magnetic fields and sunspot connection? We're currently seeing diminishing sunspot counts. The past 4 of those Schwab cycles, the past 4 of the 11-year cycles have all been reducing in strength by roughly 30% each. Okay? The sun is getting weaker. The sun is producing less energy. All right? So the cycle that we're currently in, solar cycle 24, we are exiting cycle 24. We're in the minimum of 24. Solar cycle 25 will be approaching pretty soon. Well, solar cycle 24 gave us a hint that something was off. There was a double peak. There was a lot of sunspots, a reduction of sunspots, and then more sunspots, right? So if you look at it on a wave pattern, it's up, down a little bit, then back up again. So that double peak told us something, that the magnetic fields were out of sync. Okay, so when these magnetic fields are out of sync, that's when we observe fewer sunspots. When the magnetic fields are out of sync, that's when the sun enters a cooling phase. So that cooling phase that we're about to enter is called a grand solar minimum. I studied the work of Dr. Valentina Zarkova. My PDF, I always say that the punchline of my entire 75-page presentation is only 3 slides. It's understanding Dr. Zarkova's work, and that's it. but I had to explain 2 hours of science in order to understand what her three sides mean. So it's exciting to be on the show today because just yesterday morning, Dr. Zarkova released a paper to the scientific journal called Nature. It was submitted in January and it was released yesterday morning, confirming that we are indeed heading towards a grand solar minimum, that the sun's magnetic fields are swinging out of phase. The sun has 4 magnetic fields, and they are, instead of being in lockstep, right, all 4 going up, all 4 going down, all 4 going up, all 4 going down, instead of going in sync, that double peak in solar cycle 24, that second peak, when the second peak was stronger than the first, that was the moment when the magnetic fields begin to separate. One's going up and now one's going down. So the magnetic fields are canceling each other out. The same principle as if it was a Bose noise cancellation headset. If you mimic the same sound in the headset, well, then you don't hear the noise. Same principle. So the sun is entering a grand solar minimum. It's a period of sharp cooling over the next 40 years.
Okay, so it's 40 years. Now, I'm thinking in history, it's well known that there were periods in, like the Middle Ages, you talk about the mini ice age, where, say, the Thames River in London froze over a certain number of times. And there were other periods where the Thames River, I believe, actually dried up because it was the opposite. It was hot. So how did they fit in with this?
So let me back up because this isn't just a 40-year event. We're going to see that it'll be sharp cooling over the next 40 years. But Dr. Zarkova is predicting a return to mini ice age-like conditions. She's predicting 350 to 400 years of this trend. So in order to understand where we're going, you need to understand history and study history, because history is our guide to know what to expect. The sun's output is not a constant. Rather, it's a constant oscillator. And she describes it as if it's the heartbeat, right? The heartbeat of the sun. So in order to understand where we're going, well, let's look at the mini ice age. It lasted between 1350 and 1800. Well, that's the temperature. Those are the same temperatures we're going to mimic. It's just a collection of cycles that are significantly less strong than the cycles to the left and right. So it'll be a sharp cooling trend over the next 40 years, and then it'll maintain the little ice age-like conditions.
So how does that fit when you get, like I say, the people that are predicting now? Well, we're already not just predicting them. We're seeing these really hot temperatures in some places. How does that work when you got a cooling period happening?
Yeah. So if it's 100 degrees somewhere, it has to be negative 100 degrees somewhere else. If it's 200 degrees somewhere, it has to be negative 200 degrees somewhere else. The Earth it's a balancing act. You can't have an extreme on one side and not have the opposite on the other. The Earth is trying to regulate itself. So during times of grand solar minimums, we see these wild swings in weather, right? So extreme heat is a sign and symptom of a grand solar minimum, as well as extreme cold. So as the magnetic fields move further and further apart, the weather is going to get more and more extreme. You're going to hear the word unprecedented over and over again. You're going to see 100-year floods, 1,000-year floods happening possibly weekly, right? A year's worth of rain in 24 hours. You're going to see hail, unprecedented hailstones come down. It's going to get much, much worse.
That's interesting because particularly when you're like me and you're thinking about we're heading into end times periods as the Bible predict, and those are the kind of things you would expect to see happening in the biblical end times period, the very things you're describing.
Well, I always try and stick to the facts. I stick to the science. I stick to the things that I can measure, I can touch, taste, smell, I can, but something happened that piqued my interest. In 2016, I think it was. So I was a pretty hardcore atheist most of my life. And I briefly mentioned this on my website, but I haven't talked about it on any other radio show. So I was a pretty hardcore atheist most of my life. And during this stint of being hardcore science junkie, I came across something called the Revelation 12 sign. If you're unfamiliar with that is, it was September 2017, I believe, where a particular alignment of stars was in this particular alignment for a very precise amount of time that was foretold in the Bible. And using star chart modeling, that particular alignment has never happened in the past, and it will never happen again. So it was a very eye-opening experience where now I had this brand new, this new knowledge of understanding science was colliding with my personal religious beliefs. So that's when I started to really dive into this with full throttle to try and understand what is going on. Why are we seeing this? Why is this prophesized in that book? So my intention is always never to be a fearmonger. I'm not looking to gain anything whatsoever except to educate people. That's part of the reason also why I made the presentation for free. I don't even advertise any affiliates that I'm working with, specifically to the point where I don't want to take anything from anyone. I just want to provide information. So it's difficult to explain the GSM without those scary predictions.
Yeah.
Right? Talking about unprecedented hailstones. Okay, well, if you study the past, you know what to look for in the future.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Obviously, it was a very difficult period of time that you're talking about, the middle age, sort of 1350 to 1800 in many ways. But people did survive. They kind of got through it one way or another. But it must be incredibly difficult. And, well, now we're in a situation where there's so many more people on the planet that have to be fed. And we're looking at, catastrophic sort of weather conditions in America, for example, at the moment. It's affecting the amount of corn and so on that's being able to grow. Now, that's going to affect, obviously, what people can eat, which affects not only prices, but then eventually, if there's not enough food, well, you don't need to say what's going to happen. But so if you're saying that we're going to be expecting more of this, then surely it's got to be a time that we begin to go, well, what do we actually do on a personal level?
Right. Great question. So never present a problem without a solution. I'm not up here, talking doom and gloom. So the solutions, the government isn't going to save you. Okay. They could barely handle, they couldn't even handle Hurricane Katrina, right? That's one city, one storm. Okay. The government is unable to handle this. So you cannot rely on the government to save you. We're going to have to work together as a community, right, as a neighborhood, as a family, to get through this. We need to realize that all of this division that we're experiencing, right, it's by design to keep us looking down instead of looking at the sun, instead of realizing the true danger of the sun cooling. So solutions. What are some solutions? So we both know the government won't be able to save us. Right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, the private sector. The private sector can move much more efficiently and effectively in providing solutions. Well, what kind of solutions? Food production will need to be moved indoors, without a doubt. Why is that? Because we're also seeing increase of UVC rays. Right? So when I did research on UVC rays, everything on the internet said they're stopped by the ozone layer. Well, I'm talking with a farmer a commercial farmer in near Georgia in the United States, and he's now detecting UVC rays. UVC rays are detrimental to crops. So there's a reason why these harmful rays are coming in is because our magnetosphere, the magnetic shield that's protecting our planet, is also weakening. What happens to the sun happens to our planet. It's more than just the sun cooling. What happens to the sun happens to our planet. So as the sun cools, the sun's heliosphere, right, the sun's magnetic shield weakens, which causes our shield to weaken. The sun controls everything in the solar system. So as our magnetic shield weakens, right, we start seeing an increase of UVC rays. We start seeing an increase of cosmic rays. And we are now living as of July of last year, July 2018, in the age of cosmic ray maximum. We're detecting the most amount of cosmic rays ever detected on this planet right now.
Okay, so now that makes leading me to another kind of direction. Then with this, see. I've personally seen. Well, I call it chemtrailing. People will say, "Oh, it's contrails." Where I was in California, for example, one day, I think it was about 11:30 in the morning. The sky was absolutely blue, crystal clear. Then within half an hour, a whole bunch of planes started going in different directions, crisscrossing. And by just after 12 o'clock, the whole sky had gone from blue to haze. In fact, I took a lot of pictures of it as it was going on. And what's your thoughts on it all, on that side of things?
Uh, so I'm on the side of the fence where it is the overwhelming majority cosmic rays. I don't know enough about chemtrails to have a valid opinion one way or the other, but I do know cosmic rays. And I know that we are living in the age of cosmic ray maximum. So let me explain to your viewers what are cosmic rays. So cosmic rays there's two kinds of cosmic rays. The only difference is where they emanate from, where they come from. There's cosmic rays and galactic cosmic rays. So when I say cosmic rays, I'm talking about the same thing, just depends on where they're coming from. So these are subatomic particles of atomic nuclei that are traveling at near light speed, and they emanate from our star or outside of our galaxy from other stars that have gone supernova. So these cosmic rays travel at near light speed. They're made of protons, neutrons, positrons, electrons, and they're traveling. Now, our magnetosphere, the magnetic shield that protects our planet, one of its main purposes is to shield us from these cosmic rays. Okay, we wouldn't survive for 1 second as a species on this planet without our magnetic shield. Our magnetic shield holds our wind patterns in place, it holds our atmosphere in place, and it shields us from solar wind cosmic rays. Well, that magnetic shield is weakening. And not only is it weakening, it's weakening exponentially, which meaning it's weakening faster and faster. Well, why is that? Because the sun is rapidly cooling. The sun's magnetic fields are out of phase. All right, so cosmic rays, why are they so important? And what do they do to our planet? So these cosmic travelers are moving at near light speed, and more are coming through the magnetosphere and interacting with our atmosphere. Okay, so when these things pass through the magnetosphere, when they interact with our atmosphere, they don't come down in single points and bullets. They cascade like a shower. They come down in particles. So these things, when they zip through the atmosphere, they create more clouds. It's called a cloud nucleation, right? They excite the atmosphere. They add more energy to the atmosphere. Remember, it's all particles of energy that are zipping through the atmosphere. So the reason why we're seeing more chemtrails or contrails, whatever you want to call them, is because we're experiencing more cosmic rays than ever before.
Okay, so they're causing it, you think, to actually form into the clouds more?
Correct. So it's nearly impossible for one water molecule to attach itself to another water molecule without some kind of binding agent. They need a host because they're electrically charged. So when these particles zip through the atmosphere, right, they cause the particles to attach together, causing rapid cloud formation.
Okay, so because I'm thinking back, to when I was, years ago, you'd never see, if you saw a contrail, they were very short-lived, they didn't do what they do these days, which is to go forming massive lots across the sky and lasting for hours at a time. Never saw that in my life till the last few years. So are you therefore sort of saying that the cosmic rays could be the cause of the change in that pattern?
I'm more confident that cosmic rays are the culprit than the government spending trillions and trillions of dollars or billions of dollars to spray the atmosphere.
Okay, that's a very interesting point. It's not one I'd thought of before. Cool. Because then the other thing is, do you think there is any man-made weather manipulation, or is all of this stuff that's going on simply to do with the sun? I mean, I'm aware of things like HAARP that can pump, I think, 1 billion watts of power into the ionosphere and all of that. So is there a government-backed weather warfare going on, or is this all natural, what we're seeing, in your opinion?
I don't know enough about HARP to have a valid opinion, but what I do know is this global warming, this climate change that's being forced down our throats. Everything that we're doing to this planet, whether there is weather modification or there isn't, it's like trying to use a leaf blower to slow down an approaching hurricane. What we're doing is irrelevant, right? Even if we were causing global warming tenfold, it doesn't matter because the sun gives us heat. So a good example, an extreme example, think of it like this. So let's say the sun just turned off, right? The sun went away. Gravity is still in place. We're still orbiting, right? But the sun just has no heat, right? Earth doesn't produce enough heat to sustain life. We operate on a net heat loss, okay? So the only heat that we have is from the sun. Well, let's say the sun lost half its power. Losing full power is an extreme example. Let's say half power. Even still, Earth operates on a net heat loss. A half-power sun isn't enough heat to sustain life on this planet. What if it lost a quarter power, an eighth of a power, 16th of power, right? A minor change in solar output causes drastic effects on the Goldilocks zone on our planet. We live in that perfect little area around the sun that is razor thin, right? A few million miles left or right, closer or further away, and we have extreme cooling or extreme heating on the planet. So a minor change in solar activity causes drastic effects on this planet. We're so focused on looking at ourselves that we've missed the obvious. We've missed the giant ball of heat in the sky.
So is there evidence that the weather patterns are changing on other planets, or is it just Earth?
Nope, the sun affects every planet, right? Every single planet.
Yep, and has it been documented that there's any changes going on there?
Yes, sir. I have read a few things about other events happening on Venus, happening on Mars, but I can't recall off the top of my head exactly what they are. I can give you some references after I look them up, but yes, I have read reports that other events are happening unusual on other planets because the sun controls everything in the solar system.
Yeah, see, to me that would be the one thing that you can poke at, the man-made climate change people. I'd be going, well, hang on a second, why is that change happening on Mars and Venus and whatever, if it is as well, if it's man-made, because you can't be doing man-made stuff there. So that's just
Absolutely.
where my point's going with that. But just, so how quickly will this pattern of change happen? So you're talking about we're into the beginning of a 40-year cycle. Like, is it a gradual change, or can we expect very significant changes quickly?
So the destination isn't as dangerous as the descent down. So the descent down, meaning crop losses, food shortages, right, civil unrest, right? That's the descent down I'm talking about. So how soon is all of this going to happen? Those who are paying attention, this is in my presentation, those who are paying attention would have had final confirmation that this GSM is happening of this winter that the Northern Hemisphere just left, right? Winter 2018-19, right? That winter was the final confirmation that I needed that this is eventually happening, right? Look how many cold weather records we broke, the polar vortex, look how much heat Australia had. There's just one thing after another. One extreme weather event after another, that was the final confirmation. So in 2 to 3 years, the deaf and the blind will know something is wrong. And how will they know? The first thing that the unaware person is going to see is food price increases. Now, I've been jumping up and down trying to tell anyone and everyone about what's happening. But some people just shrug it off and they don't believe me, or they just don't want to look into it, or they don't want to believe it. So the first thing they are going to see, the first thing that everyone is going to see is food price increases, because there's food shortages, right? Shrinkflation. meaning they're going to have smaller packages, but increase the price, so smaller portions. Well, then you'll go to the grocery store and wonder, where's all the avocados? Or how come there's no bananas? Or how come I haven't seen bread? How come there's don't have as much bread on the aisle anymore? Where's all the food? Right? It's going to happen slowly and slowly. So in about 3 years, it's going to be blatantly obvious to everyone that something is horribly that something is happening to the planet that they can't explain.
Do you think the governments are aware of what's going on at the moment?
I created that PDF. I've created this entire information campaign for a few reasons. One of them is I view what I'm doing as a beacon, as a beacon to attract the right attention. That's part of the reason why I also made the presentation free, is I've gained the kind of attention that I'm looking for. So I can't say much more than just there's big gears turning in the background to help world leaders understand what's happening.
Okay. So on a personal level then, what do you think people should do? Obviously people are in different situations. Some are in cities and some are in the countryside and, and obviously in different countries altogether. But what can people practically be doing at this point to be preparing?
Well, the first thing to do is, I keep on saying, is you have to understand it. You can't do anything until you mentally cross that bridge and fully accept that this is really happening. Once you cross that bridge and realize what's happening and why, well, then you can make different decisions, right? Decisions that may seem bold or may seem out of character before you understood what's happening. So once you understand what's happening, well, then you need to focus on food, right? Water, right? Seeds, learning how to grow your own food, understanding how to grow your own food. If people can, get away from population. If you can, get away from crowded population centers, right? We are not as civilized as we think we are. I spent about a decade going back and forth to the Middle East, and my friend, we are not as civilized as we think we are. So there's nothing more important than your ability to feed yourself.
Yeah, true. And I think we're going to be covering that, me and Gary and Fred, doing a show in a few days' time about this type of thing, the preparation. So it's kind of good timing, really. So what else do you want to get across to people about this whole grand solar minimum? What sort of things, do you think in the next, say, you've got, say, 10 minutes or so, what would you like to get them across to the people in terms of understanding this?
Good question. So what I always say is that it's more difficult to explain the GSM than it is to comprehend it. Once you see it, once you plug in the variable sun to anything, you can't unsee it.
Yeah. Okay. Now I'm just scrolling through because I have your PDF in front of me, and there's certainly a heck of a lot of stuff in it. That's for sure. Gosh, if people are looking for something comprehensive to explain it, it certainly is in this PDF.
So what I intended, when I first started to learn about the GSM, I kept it to myself. I didn't talk to anyone about it until I just was able to just have coherent thoughts, because I was like a fire hose, just spouting out all this just barfing science to everyone. Yeah. I'd pop into someone's life and then just barf all the science, and then they wouldn't see me for a few months, and I'd pop back in. So I realized my approach wasn't working. Right? I'm coming across as a lunatic. Right? I need to pump the brakes and reset and figure out a different way to explain it to people. So that's when I made the Beginner's Guide PDF. What I also did was I created a lecture that goes along with the PDF. So I consider it as a train the trainer kind of lecture. And when I say the first step is to understand what's happening, well, the goal of the lecture is to teach you how to teach other people. Because everyone is everyone is so focused on entertainment, on the next widget or the next thing that entertains them for a second, that people don't have the attention span to truly understand something anymore, to ask hard questions, or to really think about consequences, or play out scenarios in their head. Well, if this happens, then that has to happen, and if this happens, then that has to happen. It's a step-by-step process. So that's what I view the PDF as. It's a step-by-step process to help people understand it, and it begins with the very beginning. This is a sunspot. Why are they important, right? So the lecture is also on my website. It's free. It's hosted on YouTube. Jake and his wife Mari from the Grand Solar Minimum News channel, they interviewed me. They do fantastic work, and they interviewed me, and I ran through the presentation page by page by page, and I explained how to read the charts, what the charts mean. So I view the PDF, I view that presentation as my throttle, because I was so used to just barfing all the science at people, is I needed a way to regulate the order of information as well as the amount of information. So that's what the PDF is. It's just my throttle. There's a lot more to the lecture than what's in the PDF. So if you listen to the lecture, it's 2.5 hours. And I go into great detail explaining, or Jake and I go into great detail explaining exactly what the charts mean and why.
Okay, so I've got one more question. Thinking about the year without a summer, which was 1816. I think was it Tambora? Yeah, the
Yes,
volcano erupted, and it's recorded all over the place. It just basically didn't have a summer that year because it was a volcanic activity. Was the volcanic activity tied in with this grand solar minimum, or was it something completely separate? And if we are heading into a period of increased volcanic activity and all that now, is that caused by the sun and the grand solar minimum, or is it something completely separate from that? Because that obviously would affect our weather. If we get a string of big volcano eruptions, then we're going to have cooler weather. That's just a fact.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the answer to that is it depends on who you ask. The volcano-sun connection is relatively new science. That's why I say in the PDF is I have to explain some scientific breakthroughs. If you talk to a geologist who's been practicing for 50 years, he will say it's nonsense. But you have to understand history to understand the future. So if you study ice core data, right, the Greenland Ice Sheet Project, GISP, they can measure volcanic ash, volcanic debris in the ice core samples. Well, if you marry that up with the temperature, you can see there's an increase of volcanic eruptions during times of solar minimums. So the sun causes volcanoes to erupt. It's part of the process. It's a step-by-step process to cool the planet. When the sun dims, our magnetosphere weakens, which also causes volcanoes to erupt. So these volcanoes release millions of tons of aerosols into the atmosphere. Once these aerosols breach the 50,000-foot threshold, once those aerosols are cross that height, they'll remain in the stratosphere for years, decades to come. Now, remember earlier in our conversation, I said water molecules need a binding agent. Well, those aerosols act as the perfect binding agent. So they cause rapid cloud formation. So once you add cosmic rays to the mix, it adds more energy to the atmosphere, creating more clouds. Right? So clouds block the sun's energy, which is already diminishing. So it's a step-by-step process. Right? The planet's doing what it's supposed to do. We're just along for the ride.
Okay, that's a really good point. And of course, volcanoes put out so much more than all the cars and cows and coal factories,
Right.
All these people that are talking about we've got to stop the carbon emissions. I mean, what man does is nothing compared with a big volcanic eruption.
Yes, sir. Yeah. And let's just briefly touch on CO2 because it's hard not to talk about the climate without talking about CO2. CO2 has been dubbed the bad guy. All right, we have been we have been fooled into believing that CO2 is dangerous to our planet. We are not living in the age of CO2 maximum, not by a long shot. This is not the hottest this planet has ever been, not by a long shot. Right? Antarctica didn't always have ice. Polar bears are still here. So CO2 is a trace gas, meaning it represents 0.04% of the atmosphere. So that's insignificant. Termites produce more CO2 than man. So CO2 is stored or released by the oceans. Okay? So one thing people always talk about is rising CO2, rising CO2. Well, let's talk about the other direction. Let's talk about the basement. So at what point is the lack of CO2 an extinction level event? Humans need CO2 to survive. It's in our atmosphere for a reason. Plants need CO2 to grow. Right? CO2 is plant food. Right? Farmers inject CO2 into their greenhouses to make the plants grow faster. So at what point are we at an extinction level event? Okay, around 200 parts per million is an extinction level event for our species of CO2. Right? We are barely above that. We're around, I think, 450 parts per million of CO2. We're at the basement. We can see the basement. So if you look at the Roman warm or the medieval warm, the Minoan warm, all had far, far greater levels of CO2 than we do today. Right? Again, you have to study history to know where we're going.
So what do you actually say to people that are the CO2 buffs? You know, we've got to save the planet by decreasing our carbon emissions.
So I view what I'm doing the same way a battlefield medic treats casualties, triage. Right? If someone is steadfast in man-made global warming, CO2, I'm going to present my information, and then I've done my part. If they refuse to listen, then it's on them now. My conscience is clear. So I would rather talk to 100 people and help them understand what's happening than waste my day talking with someone who just refuses to believe that the sun controls our temperature.
Yeah, well, it makes complete sense to me, what you're saying, even though I don't get all the scientific stuff, only on a very rudimentary level, and I'll study it more, but it makes perfect sense, whereas this other global warming CO2 stuff has never sat right with me at all. Okay, now, Can you give the listeners again your website, and then maybe if you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to get across, you could do that.
Sure thing. My website is supergsminfo.com. I'm also pretty active on Twitter. It's at Charles Scott GSM. And I also have a Facebook page. It's Super Grand Solar Minimum Info. So some final thoughts is we need to work together to get through this, right? I'm not all doom and gloom. I'm a realist. So we need to set our differences aside, right? Republican, Democrat, black, white, right? Everything, set it all aside. We are one species on this planet, right? This planet's a gift. So we need to work together, set everything aside, set our differences aside to work together to solve these problems, right? These problems are not unsolvable. This isn't the end of our civilization, right? This is a beginning of an exciting challenge.
Awesome. Yeah. And it's been great having you on the A Minute to Midnight show. And if you come up with more information and you want to come back anytime with updates, just let me know and I'll be glad to have you back.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. It's been a great discussion.
Thank you.
Folks, A Minute to Midnight, we attempt to bring you good updates and be on the cutting edge of things that we think are important for you to know. With the Minute to Midnight show and with Matt writing articles and so on. Just to remind people that A Minute to Midnight is run 100% by donations, no advertising, no affiliates, nothing. And It gets a bit scary at times when the donations fall away like they have at the moment, so there's less coming in than on what's needed to live, really. So just not to make anybody feel guilty, but if you're able to help, we do really appreciate it. That's the only way we can keep this running. And of course, you can find all of our shows and our articles on the website aminutemidnight.com. And the shows are also found on iTunes, and we have audio and video versions of the shows on the website, as well as iTunes and YouTube. And don't forget to like the video on YouTube. And all the music used in the shows is written, played and recorded by me. And if you want to download the music, you can do that for free on the A Minute to Midnight website as well. We should be back hopefully in a few days' time with another episode of the show. Have a great week. God bless, and until then, this is Tony signing out and saying goodbye.